Hello everyone and welcome to episode 11 of the Life in Norway Show. Is Norway really the happiest place on earth? It's questions like this that I hope to answer as I interview other expats who live and work right here in Norway. Today brings the curtain down on season 1. The show will be back, but we're doing as the Norwegians do and taking a much needed winter break. During that break, I'll be planning season 2, so please do let me know what you think of the show. Which episodes did you most enjoy? Who should I try to interview next? But today, I have something different for you. For the first time, I'm not interviewing someone living here in Norway. Emily Skaftun is the editor of the Norwegian American newspaper, a historic publication with a truly fascinating story. As we recorded the interview a couple of months ago now, you'll notice a few references to 2017, so hopefully you can ignore those. We talk about the history of the Norwegian American community, look at some of the Norwegian-themed events that take place today all across the USA, and look at the fascinating differences between the Norwegian American culture of today and the Norwegian culture of today. Happy listening. I'd like to welcome Emily Skaftun to the Life in Norway show. Emily is my first ever guest on the Life in Norway show who doesn't actually live in Norway, but there is a very good reason for that. It is said that because of mass immigration more than 100 years ago, there are now more Americans with Norwegian heritage than there are people living in Norway. Emily is the editor of the Norwegian American. It's a community print newspaper. That's a print newspaper in this day and age, read by the grandsons and granddaughters of those immigrants. Emily, welcome to the Life in Norway show.
Thank you.
Emily, I normally start off by asking every guest how they moved to Norway, but as you didn't, let's look at things the other way around. Can you tell us a bit about the Norwegian American community and the history of it?
Well, if you don't count the Vikings, the beginning of the Norwegian migration to the Americas was started in 1825. There was a ship called the Restoration. It was a sloop, and supposedly that was the first boatload of Norwegian immigrants to America after Leif Erikson's.
So this is something that it wasn't just a one-off. This is a trend that happened for years and years and years.
For most of the 1800s. My understanding is that during that century, Norway's population was booming. The infant mortality rate dropped, and only firstborn sons inherited the land, and there's only so much farmable land in Norway, so things got really tight. And that left a lot of younger siblings to go off and seek their fortunes in America, which, of course, the streets were paved with gold there, and that's where everyone ended up in those decades. Norway lost a humongous percentage of its population to the U.S. Only Ireland lost more. The peak of the flow, I believe, was in the 1880s, but it really didn't start to slow down much until the U.S. changed its immigration policies and made it much harder for people to enter the country, and that was in 1924.
Okay, so as recently as that's not even 100 years ago, there were still Norwegians moving to America.
Well, and there still are Norwegians moving to America. My own family didn't come until after World War II.
Oh, interesting. Do you happen to know the story there of why they came over?
I not in general, not in particular. I think they just thought they could build a better life for their family in America.
Sure.
I find that a bit strange. You know, I go to Norway and I met my cousins and second cousins or once removed cousins or whoever they are who still live in Norway, and they have clearly a better life than I do. So I think sometimes that my grandfather made the wrong call, but that's a
perspectives. Yeah. So you're based in the Seattle area, I think. That's right? Yeah.
Yes.
Where in the USA are the Norwegian links strongest? Because I know from the readers I get from my blog and where the Moon Norway guidebook is being sold that there is a Norwegian influence all across the USA. But as far as I'm led to believe, there are some real community centers around the country.
There really are. We do have readers in all 50 states, but by far the biggest concentration of Norwegian Americans is in the upper Midwest. That's Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, that whole area. And the second place area in terms of concentration is probably here in the Pacific Northwest. To me, that makes a lot of sense. I look out at Puget Sound and I see that it's obviously a fjord, and I know that the Norwegians must have felt very at home here. I understand less why those in the Midwest felt so at home. It was a very different kind of climate, well, not climate, but a very different kind of landscape than what they're used to.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of pictures and videos from Minneapolis in the winter, and I think, yeah, okay, I can understand people are used to
Right.
that sort of a
Yeah,
climate.
sure. It's got plenty of cold and dark,
Yeah.
but very flat. Maybe they were just really excited to see so much arable land.
Sure. Now, the Norwegian American, it's not always been called the Norwegian American, but the publication as it is now, the history, it stretches back for a very long time, I believe. So can you give us a little history lesson this time about the newspaper itself?
Absolutely. We trace our heritage, this paper, from two Norwegian newspapers that were both started about 125 years ago. The West Coast paper was, at that time, Washington Postan, was founded in 1889 on May 17th. And then that paper, at some point, I don't know exactly when, changed its name and became the Western Viking. It became the Norwegian newspaper of the West Coast. The other paper is Nordisk Tidende. My Norwegian pronunciation is horrible. Sorry, Norwegians. And that was founded in New York in 1890. And it grew up to become Norway Times and was the Norwegian paper of the East Coast. In the middle of the country was Decorah Posten, which was published out of Decorah, Iowa, which is still a very, very, very Norwegian town. I visited it last year. Western Viking bought the Decorah Posten in 1972. And then in 2007, Western Viking and Norway Times merged to become the Norwegian American Weekly. Excuse me. Norwegian American Weekly is the paper that I was hired to edit. And it was only about a year and a half ago that we changed our name to the Norwegian American, because we made the decision to no longer be weekly and didn't want to be saddled with a name that was so clearly incorrect. So that's us.
Okay, so that's quite some changes over the years. I imagine the content too has changed. Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine the newspaper was first set up to keep people up to date with news from Norway, whereas today it's more about, keeping the traditions and the culture alive?
Yeah, that's really pretty accurate. The Norwegian press in America was actually really huge early in its history. There were, over the 100 or couple hundred years, were 400 or 500 secular Norwegian newspapers in America. Not all of them lasted very long, obviously, but they were a main source of news for not only Norwegian Americans, but also, at times, for Norwegians. Probably the heyday of the Norwegian press was during World War II. During Nazi occupation of Norway, their press was obviously muzzled, and so a lot of Norwegians actually got their news from Norwegian American newspapers. It's not clear to me whether they were subscribers and got it mailed to them directly, or if it was sent by family members. And obviously the news they got was very late, but that was one of their only uncensored sources of news.
That is really interesting. I mean, do you have boxes of dusty old copies of newspapers from the Second World War and so on behind you?
Unfortunately, I don't. I wish I did. Our archives only go back to 1965 is what I have in the office.
That's still pretty decent.
So actually, the New York branch of the paper has been fully digitized by National Bibliothek, and so that can be accessed in Norway.
Okay. So tell us about the newspaper today. I mean, I have a bit of a heads up here because I've actually written for the Norwegian American for the last couple of years, a semi-regular travel column. but I don't actually receive or read the newspaper personally. So what else is in it apart from some travel advice?
Oh yeah, travel, recipes. Those are some of the favorite sections. One of the first things I did when I took over was I realized that our news was not the thing we were the best at doing. So I did switch the focus a lot to more evergreen content that our readers seem to like. So there's a lot of heritage stories, stories about the really old school Norwegian crafts are always popular, and also on Norwegian events that are happening in the U.S. We have business and sports. We have an opinion section. I introduced a section on language because to me that's been really interesting. And arts, not just arts of Norway, but Norwegian Americans and all of those kinds of things. What else do I have in the paper? We do special issues all the time that focus on specific things. And right now I'm immersed deeply in our Christmas issue, so it's hard for me to remember what's in a normal one.
Speaking of those special issues, one that's caught my eye in the past is the 17th of May special edition. And it's not so... Right. It's not so much marking what's happening in Norway. From what I understand, it's more rounding up everything that's going on to mark the 17th of May in the States.
Yes, mostly. We Norwegian Americans celebrate the 17th of May with extreme fervor, especially here in Seattle. We've actually been doing a 17th of May parade as long as this newspaper has been published, since 1889. And every year it's held on 17th of May, rain or shine. That's true of communities all over the country. Even some really small Norwegian American communities do big celebrations.
So what do Norwegian Americans in Seattle eat and drink on the 17th of May?
Mostly drink. I don't know what they eat. No, that's not true. Pølse med lumpe. And there's a banquet. I don't know what they serve at it. Probably just American food. And yeah, so sausages, ice cream, Verdens beste kake.
It sounds pretty similar.
Yeah.
Now, these 17th of May events, they're established by various community groups and so on all around the country. Can you tell us a little bit about the infrastructure for the Norwegian American community beyond your newspaper?
Well, locally, the parade is put on by the 17th of May committee. I think that there are committees specifically to celebrate in the places that have the biggest celebrations. But more broadly, there are so many Norwegian organizations in America that it's almost ridiculous. Sons of Norway is the biggest and the most well-known. It's actually an insurance company that has a fraternal side, which I find kind of funny.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Oh yeah, ask them.
Yeah.
They sell insurance. That's their business. But it's, of course, very well known and very active in cultural events. There's also Daughters of Norway, which, as you might have guessed, is the same as Sons of Norway, only for women. Women can also join Sons of Norway. There have been some women allowed for like 100 years in certain lodges, and in all of them for decades. But there's still Daughters of Norway, and they're still opening new chapters of Daughters of Norway. So there's clearly an appeal for that. Nordmannsforbundet, Norwegians Worldwide, has a few chapters in the U.S. There are Seamen's churches. I can actually never quite remember where they all are. One just closed, and Seattle doesn't have one, which I think is weird considering how many Norwegian sailors are here.
Sure.
But the one in New York is very active, and it's still a very Norwegian organization. You know, for example, if you go to their website, there is no English version. We also have the NACC, that's the Norwegian American Chambers of Commerce, and there's a national governance to that, as well as a lot of city and regional chapters. Our local chapter, I think, mostly exists to support having a Yule board every year. I don't know what else they do. There are loads more. I'm going to forget most of them. There are Torskeklover, the old boys club where people, I guess, eat cod and drink aquavit. Then there's Lakselaget, the women's version, where I guess they eat salmon. Yeah.
That is an incredible list of organizations. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
in Norway, volunteer associations, interest groups, charities, non-profits are very, very common. It's usual for somebody to belong to one or two of these kinds of things. It's the same in America, I would suspect. It's not just a Norwegian American thing.
I don't really know that much about it outside of the Norwegian American community. Honestly, I didn't know about belonging to groups. Really, that's not a thing that I grew up with. So I'm not sure. I think that there are a lot of these heritage groups, and a lot of people belong to more than one of them, more than one of these Norwegian ones. There's a lot of overlap. And so many of them. One of the fascinating things, I think, is how many there are and how specialized some of them are. There's also like Greek society.
Okay.
Yeah, super specific kinds of things.
One question before we head into the break. I'm really fascinated, so I do have a lot of questions, but I'll keep it to one. I assume you get a lot of feedback from readers, whether it's people emailing in or whether it's people you meet as you travel around the US. What is it that people are most keen to read about? Is it the community events going on in the States in all these groups? Or is it actual news and features from Norway, or a mixture?
I think it really depends on the reader. A lot of our oldest readers, and I mean that in both ways, they don't seem to care very much about what's happening in Norway.
Okay.
Yeah, it's primarily about Rosmaling and Lefse and Hardangerfiddle and Bunads and Javielsker and all of that, like typisk Norsk. I don't know. That's always popular among a certain cohort of my readers. It's now, I don't want to make anybody mad. I'm not going to say those things aren't interesting, but to me, they're not eternally interesting, or they're not as interesting as what's actually happening in modern Norway. And I think that I have a lot of other readers who are like me and hope to get more of those kinds of readers. So I publish what I think is interesting. And I mostly don't get a lot of feedback for people who are like, wow, that was great. I mostly hear from my readers when they hated what I did.
Right.
So
right.
it doesn't happen too often, but when it does, I'm like, okay, that didn't work. We won't talk about hunting anymore.
Gotcha. Interesting stuff. Emily, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, I want to ask you a few questions about when you came to Norway recently. This episode of the Life in Norway show is sponsored by the Moon Norway Guidebook. One Amazon reviewer called it the gold standard for guides to Norway, the best and most readable travel guide to Norway published in many years. Good coverage of the less obvious treasures of this beautiful and inviting country. If you're planning a trip to Norway this year, pick up your copy today from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your local independent bookstore. You can find out more information about Moon Norway, plus links to buy the guide, from lifeinnorway.net/moon. Welcome back to the Life in Norway show. I'm with Emily Skaftun, the editor of the Norwegian American newspaper, our first guest on the show that doesn't actually live in Norway. But you've been to Norway a couple times, Emily. I want to ask you some questions about that shortly. But first, do you have any or many Norwegian readers? And if so, are they interested in coming to America to maybe investigate the Norwegian American community, or do they ask any questions about the community?
Well, I don't have really good stats on who our readers are, where they live, except for the print version. And so I do know that I have some Norwegian readers who live in America already. So some of our biggest supporters are recent immigrants. And, you know, the owner of the newspaper is from Norway. I actually have not been asked questions from Norwegians wanting to move to the U.S., although we did run a story recently about Norwegians doing research in the U.S. on Norwegian Americans. That was in our language special issue, and it's one of my favorite stories we've done recently because there are communities in the upper Midwest where these really, really old forms of the Norwegian language still are clinging to life. They have a few speakers left, and it's very, very different from modern Norwegian. And there have been some linguists doing research there. So things like that are fascinating. And I've also heard from other people, Norwegians, that the Norwegian American culture that we have in the U.S. is incredibly different from what's in Norway. And I think it's clear how that happened. Our ancestors came over here in the 1800s, and they brought 1800s Norway with them and kept it that way.
Sure. And a very rural way of life as well back then.
Yeah.
Okay, so coming back up to date then, you've visited Norway not once but twice. When and where did you visit?
One time I went to Norway was before I took this job, and once was after. And the first time was with my family. It was in 2012, and the main reason for the visit was a family reunion. My father's side is the part of my family that's from Norway, and they came over when he was 7. So all of our family on that side is people we know, which is very unlike most Norwegian Americans who have to do genealogical research to learn who their distant ancestors or distant relatives who are still living there are. But we went for this family reunion. So we stayed largely in the Bergen area, but we also took the Hurtigruten up to Kirkenes and spent one day in Oslo, and then took the train back to Bergen. I'm the only one in my family who didn't grow up speaking Norwegian. So for me, that trip was very isolating. Almost everyone in my family in Norway is proficient in English, and even the very little kids wanted to practice their English with me.
Sure.
Except, of course, for the family we stayed with. They were the ones who didn't have any English. Thanks, Dad. But even so, I found that one-on-one, everyone was willing to talk to me, and it was great. But as soon as there were 2 of them together and one of me, that went away completely. So that was my first trip. My second visit was last August, and I actually went for work, which was maybe the coolest thing I've ever done. Right? I mean, people used to ask me all the time, oh, do you get to go to Norway all the time for work? And I was like, no, we barely have budget for payroll. But visit Oslo and visit Lillehammer, and the Pagan Festival actually brought me over so that I could write stories about those places and things. So that trip was incredible. By then I'd been studying Norwegian for 2.5 years. Which of course is still completely inadequate for actual human communication. I've been focusing mostly on learning to read the Norwegian news anyway. But so I'd be sitting there in Norway wanting to practice my Norwegian with people, and just no one would let me at all. I'd be sitting there at breakfast, reading VG, trying to, and the waiter would come up and ask me, "Would you like more coffee?" I'd go into 7-Eleven and try my hardest. I'd say, "Jeg vil ha en pølse," and the clerk would reply, "Would you like to add a soda?" for however many kroner that was. It took me days to find a waitress who had terrible enough English that my Norwegian was better than her English, and finally got to try it.
Yeah, I think that's an issue many people will recognise. Tell us a bit about the Pagan Festival.
The Pagan Festival is incredible. I felt really lucky to be able to go over there. It's held up at Lake Golo, which is in the wild, I guess, north of Lillehammer, and held on the shores of a lake near the ancestral home of the actual pagan. I also actually got to visit Pagan's home. I happened to be riding with someone from the festival who was actually one of the creators of the festival. I can't remember his name right now, but a super volunteer with them. And he was driving me around and showing me the sights, and we went to Pagan's grave. And then he drove me up so we could look at the house. And it happened that the man who owns it was there and knew the guy and invited us in for coffee. And that was very, very cool. I guess he used to run it as a boutique hotel. The festival marked a milestone, which I should have looked up, but so I don't know which one it was. And last year, the production that I saw was the last of that production. It had been done for 3 or 4 years, I think. And this year they have a new team. And I regret that I couldn't make it over there to see it, because I think it would have been fantastic.
Yeah.
But they'll be doing that production for a few years, so I hope I can get there. It was stunning. It was obviously in Norwegian. And one of the reasons I was there was because they had rolled out an audio summary for English visitors and also German. But I couldn't get it to work right, and I just became immersed in watching the play anyway. I knew the story, so I was following along the best I could. And it was, the way they did the music and the way they used the lake, and it rained. It was freezing. I was wearing every bit of clothing that I brought with me, plus several layers that I borrowed from my host. I don't own rain pants. And I was still pretty cold, but it was amazing. And I was watching these actors get out there into that freezing lake and hack a tree to bits with a real axe, which is something you don't do in American theater. I asked my host about that, and if he'd ever cut himself. She was like, yeah, maybe once.
That sounds amazing. It really, really does. It's not something a lot of people get the opportunity to do. So you're very lucky.
Yeah.
On these travels, did anything about Norway, compared to your perception of Norway, did anything surprise you about the reality of being in Norway?
It's hard for me to say. By the time I took my second trip, I'd already been immersed in all things Norway for more than 2.5 years.
Of course.
So I feel like I was really, really well prepared for Norway. And the first time I was there, it's hard to recall because all of my perceptions had been completely reset since then. I do remember being surprised by the price of beer. I was hoping that you all in Norway just make a lot more money than I do, because I sure couldn't spend $15 on a pint. I learned a lot each time. One thing that surprised me was breakfast in Norway. The first time I went, I had no idea what to expect. And I remember we were staying in this kind of country home, and the first morning they bring out this spread, and there's all these different kinds of cheese and meat paste and a number of other things that I didn't have a word for then, but now I know are pålegg. And I was like, wow, look at that. That's cool. And then everything we ate and they put it all away. And then it was lunchtime and the same spread came out. And I was like, oh, okay. This is what people eat in Norway. This exact thing. There. When I went back, though, I was very just happy. It felt like welcome home to have all of the savory breakfast options in the hotel smorgasbord. Fish for breakfast. Love it.
Brown cheese as well, or not?
No, actually, I do not like toast. I have attempted to learn to like it. And recently, I had a bite, tiny little few microns of brown cheese on a big piece of apple. That went down okay. There's a genius of Nordic cuisine in Seattle who runs a cafe, and she has toast cheesecake, which is fantastic. But no, I was actually severely traumatized by toast as a child because I thought it was revolting, and my dad thought that was hilarious, and would try to sneak it into my food in various ways. I remember one time he brought a block of it out of the freezer, and he told me that it was peanut butter, and I took a great big bite of it. I think it's an acquired taste. Actually, I think it's a genetic taste, and I'm actually adopted, so I think I don't have the gene for brunost.
I think it's fair to say it is an acquired taste. A lot of people claim to love it. And I know a lot of the Norwegian American community do as well, because a lot of the Norwegian American community are my readers also. Yeah, I guess different people like different things. I'm not a fan of it myself. You're not either, but
I don't eat lutefisk either. My family does have it on Christmas Eve, but I've never been one to partake in it.
Okay, Emily, let's talk a little bit about the newspaper again. What are some of the challenges in running such a publication in 2017? We had recently a guest on, Will, from The List, which is a English language publication here in Trondheim, and I'm curious to know if some of the problems that they've overcome are shared by yourselves.
What are some of the challenges? There's almost nothing but challenges to running a print newspaper in the year 2017. The main challenge, of course, is declining readership, which is something that every print paper is seeing. The internet is giving it away for free, what we're selling, or at least that's the perception. I actually don't know how true it is in our case. Frankly, I think that if it were true, it wouldn't be so difficult to research some of the topics that we publish about in the paper. Pretty often we turn out to be the only, or at least one of the better source of English language information on certain Norwegian topics. But that's still a hard thing to get people to understand if they're not already a subscriber. You know, even myself, when I came into this job as a 30-something person, there was no part of me that would ever have subscribed to it. Now that I know what it is, I think it's pretty good. So the biggest challenge, I guess, is marketing. Once people have seen the paper, they usually like it. I have actually that same person with the toast cheesecake is always pushing the paper on visitors to the cafe, and she calls it surprisingly interesting. I think I'd like to use that as our slogan. Surprisingly interesting. The other big challenge of print is, of course, shipping it.
Sure.
We rely on the U.S. Postal Service, and it's one of our biggest expenses. And we get periodical rate shipping. And even so, it can take like 10 or more business days to reach certain parts of the country. It's ridiculous. We have the paper printed in Minnesota because it's like kind of more or less in the middle and near a big concentration of our readers. But to get it to Florida and California and Alaska, it's nuts. So breaking news is not our specialty. But that's why I've moved away from breaking news sorts of stories and focusing more on things that don't go bad in 10 days, like travel stories and food stories and all of that fun stuff.
Sure.
If people want news from Norway, they can go online and read it, especially if they speak Norwegian.
Absolutely. Emily, this has been really interesting chat, getting to know the Norwegian American community. I do have 3 questions that I ask every guest. They don't really apply in this case, though, because they're to do with what people enjoy and dislike about living in Norway. But there is a 3rd question which I can ask you. Where is your favourite place in Norway?
Well, that's a really hard question because there's so much about Norway that's great, and there's so many parts of it that I haven't been to yet. I almost want to say that some of my favorite places in Norway are some of the places I've seen epic pictures of and never been to yet, but I have on my list. But I won't. One place that I really, really enjoy that I've actually been to twice is the Vigeland Sculpture Park in Frogner Park in Oslo. The first time I went there and I was told I couldn't miss it, and I saw why immediately. We have nothing like that in this country. The fact that some of those statues are so almost lewd. I mean, they're so bold, and some of them are so creepy, but they're so wonderful, and they're right out there, and people are climbing all over them and taking the most ridiculous selfies they can come up with. That was great. On my more recent trip, I went up to Ekeberg Park. Is that the one?
Ekeberg, yeah.
The new sculpture park, newer, I guess, in Oslo. And I didn't get to see more than 2 or 3 of the sculptures there because it's enormous. And a place in Oslo that I was fortunate to be able to visit this time that not a lot of tourists get to go to is actually the Gustav Vigeland, I believe. I may have my Vigelands mixed up, but the other Vigeland mausoleum, which is an incredible thing and spooky and dark, and I can't ruin it with my words. If you live near Oslo, you should go on the one day of the week that they're open.
Some really interesting recommendations there. Emily, thank you very much. Where can people find out more about the Norwegian American and perhaps even subscribe?
Of course. Our website is norwegianamerican.com. It's spelled just like you think it would be. And we do offer online-only subscriptions for those of you who live in Norway.
Fantastic stuff. Emily, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.